So I would say that my journey that I'm going to use to exemplify some of the ideas that I'm putting forward in front of you was started as a doctor in an academic world. I was also one of the better students in wherever, and then I was happy doing academic medicine in a good institution in Delhi. And then, but since I was also interested, like all of us, in the whys and hows of ill health, more than just how to treat and how to diagnose. I realized that since most patients come from rural India, I decided to relocate to rural India, and I chose to work. And there was also the additional bit that I was affected by the inequality in achieving health and due to unequal access to healthcare, which I thought was due to injustice that people got inequality in healthcare, that moved me to consider some of those decisions that I did. So, and I was also a disciple not only at AIMS but also of Rudolf Virchow, that famous German doctor philosopher, who said that if illnesses are due to deprivation, then physicians become the natural attorneys of the poor. And thus, I moved into rural central India, which was, if you see, this is bordered by the eastern Madhya Pradesh, which is the Baghelkhand poor area, the eastern bit of Maharashtra, which is the Gadchiroli and Chandrapur area, the Telangana bit of Chhattisgarh, the northern part of Telangana, the western and southern Orissa, which are the poorest parts of India, and also the Jharkhand, western Jharkhand, as well as the
Would everyone but the speaker please mute yourself?
Sorry. So the Mirzapur and the Renuput area of UP. This is the epicenter of underdevelopment, if I say, would be in this part of Chhattisgarh that we moved into, where what the context was of inaccessibility. The context is of inaccessibility, like this pregnant woman being brought across the river in a makeshift trolley, and a jeep that gets stuck in a river, which is being pulled by animal power across a river in space. And this part of the terrain was forested and peri-forested areas, where we set up the community health program, which had a hospital and a peripheral village-based community program. And the second bit of the context was, besides inaccessibility, the hunger. As the sanitized word, undernutrition is actually, malnutrition is a sanitized word for hunger, medically sanitized. So where the median weights of women were 41 kilos and median weights of men, I'm talking about non-patient people, are 50 kilos. Also in that, nutrition had a pecking order, with the people who belong to the PVTG, the particularly vulnerable tribal group, having a median BMI of 18.3, which means that 50% people had even a BMI lower than 18.5. And then the other tribes and the Dalits in that order had BMIs because of poor access to food, which was dependent, which had a pecking order. So this program had a rural agroforestry economy, and 3,000 villages, people from 3,000 villages, mostly peopled by Adivasis and Dalits, accessed this health center that we developed outside Bilaspur town. As well as the second tier was the outreach clinics that we ran in 3 different areas, which catered to people from 150 villages. And in 72 villages, we had an intensive village health worker program for a population of less than 40,000. And this, where we could set up an OPD, which could shame many OPDs, very busy one, and a health and simple wards where men and women were together, but because relatives were also of the opposite sex often. and running a low-cost pharmacy, where we would provide generics at much lower rates than what you get at the MRPs in the market, transferring the profits to the patients in a sense without where they could get cheap, and with pictorial slips to help people understand how they have to take the medicine. And then also a laboratory, which actually is one of the ignored bits in primary healthcare, where between a centrifuge, a colorimeter, and a microscope powered by a battery, you can do almost anything. And in our own referral central laboratory, we had this rough, tough, and the buff. If you remember, this was the LJ media plates with CV bacteria were growing, to basic microbiology, microscopy, as well as doing water quality testing through simple technology development for rural areas, where even one could do despecialization. There is a pediatrician who's doing anesthesia in newborns, to developing technology that would allow using a teaching stethoscope with a single chest piece and two sets of earpiece, where the trainer could train the young trainee in picking up the right sounds, as well as also being checked whether they are knowing it correctly also or not. And our focus was there to provide primary health care, which actually means all common and important problems, care for that on grounds of equity and affordability, where cost, quality, and access are important. They're not, and we really believe that primary health care is not primary level care only. So if a snake bite requires ventilation, then that is also primary health care, but okay, that is at a secondary level of care that you're providing. And it is not actually second-rate medicine for the have-nots. That if my child gets pneumonia, then I get amoxicillin, my child gets amoxicillin. But if a poor person's child gets pneumonia, then he gets cotrimoxazole. That is not primary health care, the way I would define it. Or if in India you get leprosy and you get once a month rifampicin, but if you get leprosy in US, you would get rifampicin every day of the month. So they cannot be two standards. So it's not a second-rate medicine, have not, and it is not straitjacketed protocols which are trivialized and regimes. That is immoral medicine, if I may say. So my thesis today that I'm going to pose with examples is that public health is not fundamentally different from clinical medicine. It is not. The essential problem is that oftentimes in public health, there is the underpinning of equity in the intervention that we consider as public health or primary health care. And there I might like to posit individual and public health as, the ethics and goals are similar. I must say this, and it's a continuum, going from, because the community is actually a collective of all the individuals in a community, plus the other dynamics that happen in community, which are different from only when you consider individuals, and the tools may be different. Yes, in individual care you would do an examination, a history, and in a public health you would do, say, something like a survey and doing focus group discussions. The scales are different, surely, but this has been the thing. When you are looking at public health problems and you want to find solutions, then simple solutions are the best, no doubt. But if the optimal solution is complex, so be it. You can't scale up, public solutions by dumbing it down. You need to sort of, if tuberculosis care requires different, different levels of drugs, different doses of drugs, which are, with narrow weight bands. So be it. You cannot say, our people will not be able to handle it, therefore we should just have two doses, one for adults and one for children. That is not fair. And I might like to just pose here one of things that I often say. When we consider doctors, as we all are on this call, and when you consider public health, for me, there's a type 1 doctor, which most people in medical colleges and research institutions would be, who can ask the right questions to diagnose an illness by then performing the right examination, then choosing the right investigations, and then collating all those things to decide what a diagnosis is and use the knowledge that they have to heal the body or the mind, as the case maybe with the illness is called. And since because there are illnesses in the community which are of their types, you can't choose to say, oh, I'm a surgeon and I will not be able to conduct a delivery, or if there is a if someone is having a postpartum hemorrhage, or if there is a newborn if there's a child who comes with a pneumonia, then a adult medicine fellow cannot say that I only look at adults. So in that sense, if you require skills of different types by a primary healthcare doctor, then that is something like what I would define as a Kishore Kumar type of a doctor. A Kishore Kumar who could sing, produce, dance, act, and do whatever, unlike a Salman Khan who can only probably act. So that is what my type 1 doctor would be. And my classic example would be any of these great consultants that we have in medical colleges, who would be also then training the doctors who are attending their clinics to learn about the way they both diagnose and start healing. My type 2 doctor, which is beyond that, is of a doctor who's trying to address the whys and hows. So if there are 5 children coming with diarrhea from a particular area, then the doctor is not only interested in diagnosing and then looking at dehydration and then treating them with either an antibiotic or only with refrigeration fluid, but also looking at whether the water is gone bad. And if there are children coming with, lot of children are coming with multiple infections, then someone looks at whether the undernutrition is an underlying thing, and then tries to have supplementary nutrition programs or to do, some other measures of at a clinical level. And most departments of public health, what was pejoratively called as PSM in the past, would be people who would fall in that category. And I think a lot of NGOs who try to do work addressing, the whys and hows in a proximate manner, looking at the cause immediately before the illness or the consideration or the problem in consideration, then that would be my type 2 doctor. But my type 3 doctor is one who's looking at more basic determinants. If there is a lot of undernutrition in Bastar, that is because people's lands have been taken away, which is due to a decision to hand over the land to, say, corporate bodies. Then if you're looking at why Adivasis have been removed from the piece of land, it may be a political question, but actually it is also a health related, directly related to health. Or if a lot of people are able to access drugs that in our community because the prices of drugs are high, and they're higher than what people can pay, even though our rates may be lower than the Western world of the drugs. And if there is no price control of drugs, and working on price control of essential drugs is then my type 3 doctor's job. You might ask me what am I? I also started as a type 1 doctor at maybe 0.5 and then became 1 type. At this moment, I call myself Doctor 2.5. So I'm already being past 2 and trying to be 3. But those are decisions that we all have to take. We need all the types of doctors, and you can choose. You can take your sides, and we talk about this more. So this is a question that came up to me several times over these years. So I would quote this person. There's a person called Archbishop Camara in Brazil who said this. Really, when I gave food to the hungry, they called me a saint. But when I asked why they were hungry, they called me a communist. If that is the question, then I would be happy to say I'm a doctor communist, which I don't care about what in Brazil, if you were called a communist, it was being akin to someone being called a Maoist in India now. But then, so my journey in public health started as an academic physician, has been to move from individual health to public health, from individual to public, from curative preventive also. Yes, continuing with curative. I still spend about 40% of my time in actual clinical care, from intuitive learning to evidence-based learning, but also non-intuitive paradigm. So this is something that one has to everything that cannot be measured, as we know, evidence-based medicine is not the only way to look at data. From service to training and advocacy. So, training more people, and as my choice of training of health workers is village health workers and mid-level practitioners, more than just physicians and specialist physicians. That I started with. From healthcare, doing to healthcare to acting on social determinants is what I also choose to do. From simple human technology to using information technology is another thing that I using both telemedicine and telemedicine. As I said, I understood over the years of time that because of the lack of underpinning of equity in our public health interventions has been the bane of public health in India, as well in probably the poorer parts of the world. So, this question so often, are we looking for an efficient system, or are we looking at equity and even effectiveness and humanity? If there was an order for these variables, I would choose equity and effectiveness and humanity above efficiency. And because of the input of these economists in healthcare, they are looking at efficiency and they're looking at cost effectiveness, which are, I think, another degree variable that should be governing our decisions to do whatever type of healthcare. So the process, about equity is oftentimes we are talking about whether it is about us or as the amorphous community, where the people who make the decisions don't bear the consequences of the decisions, and the people who suffer these consequences don't have a voice. So, and this has been the problem of public health interventions. We make baseless assumptions because we don't do the data don't collect the data to make decisions on. And this is something, which is a problem. I wonder whether all of you understand what GovStat is. Good old boys sat around a table. Those are decisions that are taken about public health interventions, and excuses of size. Oh, we are a big country, or we are a complex community and expensive. We don't have the money to do it, are given to make interventions which don't really work. And I'll use some examples today now to for in the next 20 minutes to explain. Say, let's take the case of falciparum malaria as a clinical problem, which excites me. We know that the Adivasis, the tribals, are 8% of the country, but almost 70% of falciparum malaria happens among them, and over 50% of deaths happen due to falciparum malaria among them. Of malaria deaths happen among them. And the problem is because there are certain people who are Adivasis stay in rural area, in tribal, in forested areas. Therefore, they get more chances of getting falciparum malaria and they die. And see, we then looked at the question. Oftentimes, is it possible for a person in an off-the-road village to get a report for a blood smear for malaria in good time? A good time is within 24 hours. Then falciparum malaria can kill very soon. We know that in the past, what was decided was if anyone had fever, I remember even in inland paper, notice it was written, "Koi bhi bukhar malaria ho sakta hai." You give chloroquine then to everyone. And we messed up one of our important drugs, chloroquine, and then became resistant to that. And then, we still, malaria has come down due to other reasons now. But the fact is that most people would not get blood smear reports within even 28 days. If you remember that circuit, that a physician, that a health worker would take a smear, then they would send a headquarter public health center, primary health center, and the report would be, samples would go in a week, then they would be seen next time they go on a next Monday, and they would get reports, and then they would come back, and by this time either the patient would have been dead or would have been fine by now. And can we prevent overdiagnosis, and can we even monitor drug resistance? Was a question that we also asked when we were faced with this problem while working in Bilaspur. So there we found this question: can if the lab people cannot come to the lab, can the lab go to the patient? And can we avoid a short therapy, which is done in the absence of laboratories? So we train our health workers to be able to make blood smears. I'm talking about village women who probably otherwise would be unlettered. and this is one of our health workers going into a family of a Adivasi child, where she goes and examines and make blood smears on thick smears. In malaria, what is important is thick smears, which are not often taught to us in clinical care. And these smears would be then from that village would be sent with children who, after drying them up, wrapping them in paper and writing the basic information on a pictorial form, and then they would in soap boxes. And these children would carry, if in rural India, most high schools are there on main road schools. Children have to go often after primary school to main road schools, where they could take the boxes and leave it with the roadside shop. And then these would be ferried buses which fly from rural areas to the nearest big town in the morning hours. And they would be then outside in our health center, they would be collected, where we set up a referral and reported on priority by a physician or by a trained technician. And then the reports would be made ready within 2 hours of the thick smears. And then these smears would then send the reports of this, with the decision whether this person has to, be brought to a hospital or has to be given, something like quinine or artesunate, or, you should look at other causes if the smear is negative, would be then laid back in these same soap boxes for them to arrive by the time the students have to go back to their villages in the evening, so that they give the reports to the health worker on the same day. And this we have been running for 17 years, and we could avoid the other advice that was given: bring microscopes and microscopists to each village, which was not feasible, and it never worked. And thus we ran this thing and could report all our malaria smears within 24 hours and saved lives. And this also allowed us to, pick up one other important message that came up over time. When I was teaching at AIIMS, Delhi, if someone told me if I would ask the question, which is a peak season for malaria, for falciparum malaria, most people, if they would say that it is a disease winters, I would have failed them then, or I would have, been upset. But when we examined for central India in our own area, we realized that the peak November, not in the monsoon period. And when do you celebrate when do we celebrate our National Vector-Borne Disease Day or National Malaria Fortnight? It is in mid-June, which is completely missed. So in over years and years, our data showed that the malaria season was of a winter disease. And when we even monitored in 2010 a major epidemic, the maximum number of deaths happened in the second week of November, between 5th and 12th of November, and in that year. And that was a peak. And we saw this in the IDSP, which was the Integrated Disease Surveillance Project. They reported that in the week of 5th to 12th of November, they did not report any malaria in the entire country. Forget about the number of deaths that I showed you in the previous slide. So the point is, we have a useless system, which is and is an unaccountable system, which doesn't help the people. But if you had interest to do such a thing in your own area, then you would be able to support the community, which is what we are all supposed to do. I would now then jump on to, after this 2 examples in malaria, I would go to the understanding of tuberculosis as a problem in Chhattisgarh. And the other MDR, the one MDR is what we know about multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, resistance to both INH and rifampicin. But in Chhattisgarh, we realized that there is another MDR, which is malnutrition, M for malnutrition, D for diabetes, and R for retrovirus, in that order. So this is a story of a person I saw about 11 years ago, a person who is 52 years old, who came to me with malaria, with tuberculosis symptoms. He was just symptomatic, and I had to examine him in a peripheral clinic. And when I looked at his weight, if you can see, you can zoom it and see, it's 28.7 kilos. A man of 52 kilos had a weight of 28.7. If you look at him again. So, but when we talk about, I want to talk about the fact that we could, through our advocacy, we could get additional food being provided to all TB patients in this country. something that was, and these are the weights that we would see with people who come with tuberculosis in central India, where hunger is what is probably the most important determinant of, of tuberculosis. Or a family, or a family of three, the father, son, and the daughter getting Putin positive tuberculosis at the same time. And when we looked at the data of tuberculosis, at least one thing that we could introduce there in our clinical program was that we weigh everyone every time and accurately, not just with that bathroom scales that are pushed under the head nurse's table, which is picked up at times when you pick up someone who's obviously undernourished. So everyone should be weighed every time, and that is probably Dr. Vijayalakshmi Bhatia, I will say that it is because of my pediatric training that we could get that we made all adults also weigh everyone every time, and they're taking their height, and our median weights in all adults, were 42 kilos and these were the weights in men, and 34 kilos was the median weight. And if you remember, median weights mean that 49% people had weights lower than this also among women with tuberculosis. And the heights were equal to that of the other community people, 162 and 161. And if you see, over 55% people had BMI lower than 18.5 and then lower than 16 also. The median BMI was 16, 1.6. And I had 15% people who had a BMI lower than 13, which is supposed to be incompatible with life by the criteria of Dr. Shetty So we know that undernutrition in tuberculosis is associated with more extensive disease. It is associated with higher risk of death and with drug toxicity, and also higher risk of relapse. And yet, in our country, with 88% people having BMI lower than 18.5, the WHO unleashed on us an intermittent regime, which they did not change for 15 years. We fought, and finally we filed a case in the Supreme Court as a writ petition, and then in 2019 September we could win the case to get daily treatment for tuberculosis, which was something that that required labor. And if you remember that the Madras trial of 1962 had shown that those people who had domiciliary treatment in compared to home treatment or the sanatorial treatment had actually their microbiological cure rates were similar. But if you look at the weight gains, women gained 11 pounds weight in this period of treatment, because when they were in a sanatoria, because they did not have to spend the energy on doing all the homework that all women in a patriarchal world have to do, and yet weight gain was not considered as an important thing then, and that's why we removed the sanatorial treatment then. And we learned from Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the Western world, that cure rates of when free treatment and food was also given improved to 100% from 56.7%. But we did not change it. So, and this has been a part of the problem it's a political problem. We don't want to talk about adult undernutrition. Undernutrition has been relegated to a problem of the under 3 or under 5. I'm even as a pediatrician, I feel that it's because it is more difficult to handle adult undernutrition. We have trivialized adult undernutrition, and it's almost we have sanitized the word hunger to call it malnutrition. And then even in that, the discourse these days is that malnutrition is a combination of obesity and undernutrition, which is not saying, which is in a sense depoliticizing the fact that most of the malnutrition is due to undernutrition, and that is due to hunger. So and therefore these treatment regimes which required which were these, if you remember, relapses were happening. We saw so many relapses with people who were undernourished and were getting the 6 months of ATT with the intermittent regime that was being done. But slowly we worked on it, and when we asked this question, so we looked at our data, and then so many relapses had happened, and the WHO was not ready to change. We had enough number of fights as people who were working in the field, but also had an academic background, and have been fighting since 2006. We started using the intermittent regimes in 2002 in our hospital, And only, the Central TB Division, we fought in 2000, from 2008 to 2013. We published a review on that. But Supreme Court case, sorry, this is September 2017, not 2019 that we won the case there. So this agony of what is called otherwise consumption tuberculosis, who advises the government? Why don't our leaders see reasons? But my largest problem, and why don't we have supplemental food? And I would say, in that sense, the academia, people who look after tuberculosis, who study the bug and the disease, have failed the people because they don't put the questions, because it is considered politically, inappropriate to talk to someone senior and question it and show, what data comes out. And I think that is part of growing from type 2 doctor to type doctor 2.5 or 3, that we have to speak up for the people on basis of the clinical work that we do. I don't think we have to hold flags to become, to get people their due. I think even as academic people, we can do this. And so I would come to the question that would be most interesting to all of you. Majority of you are endocrinologists in this group. I had this person, 35-year-old Jethuram Uike, who I had been seeing for 10 years for various small illnesses that he had been coming with in different settings. He lost 1 unit point BMI from 17.5 to 16.5 in 2013. And he came with a cough, with a duration, with a short duration of cough in 2013. 17.5 BMI is not an unusual BMI for a person in the area that I work in. Even when one is healthy, and in a sense one is going around doing one's job. He was sputum positive, and then when I checked up, which we do for all people as part of the guidelines, checked the blood sugar, it was 560 milligrams per deciliter. He was slow in responding, and required metformin, and we also had to give him insulin for these controls. He was 35 years old, if you see that, and he was 16.5 BMI when he came. The question that we posed was, why did he have diabetes? Which faulty lifestyle that he had led, which we blame for the lifestyle of the change that we are talking about, the lifestyle of the sedentary lifestyle that we blame for the diabetes pandemic that we have in the country, the epidemic. He did not take tobacco. He had no weight gain. He was working every day of his life till he was unfit, and he did not have HIV. Checked his oil intake was only 11 grams per day in his family, and there were no fruits that he had been taking. So this has been the enigma of diabetes in a rural area, as we saw in our JSS experience. 80%, believe me, 80% are low in body weight or normal body weight. In fact, 35% of people have a BMI lower than 18 when they come with an illness, and it is not. And we have for many of them, we have the BMIs, for 5 years before that also. And we looked at this thing that what is this low body weight type 2 diabetes and malnutrition, modulated diabetes mellitus is, which came into the WHO protocol for in the definition classification for diabetes, but was removed later. And this majority occurs in hard-working and poor people. Peripheral neuropathy, infectious nerve complications are common in the first set of years, and over 50% would require insulin in the 6 months of their illness. It's not that they require it later, like a lot of type 2 diabetes might get 5 or 10 years later. And when we looked at the data in 2009, as early as that, the median, weight was 43 and 40 in men and women, and waist circumferences were 73 and 79 in women and men. And this was a comparison of one of our lab assistants with 3 women with with this so-called lean diabetes, as we would like to call. And with their height being normal, these are also 2 other people with type 2, this low body weight type 2 diabetes. So this lean diabetes, 70% having BMI lower than 23, 40% having BMI lower than 18.5, 50% requiring insulin early. Blood sugars are usually between 400 and 600 milligrams per deciliter at presentation. Median age is 42 years, a decade earlier than type 2 classic diabetes. difficult to classify, not FCPD, not a dehydration, not type 1 or type 2 or MODY. So what is the set of advice would you give to these people? More exercises, do yoga or eat less? No. So why can't we? And I think this is one of the poorest illnesses to have been studied. There was work done in Cuttack by Dr. Tripathi in late 60s. And after that, there are so little publications. I saw more publications coming from Ethiopia on this than from India on this problem. And I think this is, I'm exhorting, the group that is there today to consider this illness worthy of, both trying to understand the pathophysiology, but also what is the care advice I should do in a place which is eating mainly rice, white rice now provided through the PDF, and a little bit of bhaji, that is the green leaves, hardly any dal or any meat. And what is it that we have to do? I would then go on to another question, in a rapid way, to talk about communitization of healthcare. So we have created this health outpost in the country called health and wellness centers that we know, which is the sub centers and the PHCs, upgraded to become these wellness centers also. We are fostering and supporting mid-level health workers, because we know that doctors are not going to go to rural India in any large numbers. And in the absence of those physicians, the Jhola Chhap doctors, or family practitioners as we call them, they are the ones who are providing care. So can we have someone who's more competent to provide health, which is beyond the capacity of the ASHAs or the village health workers? And so therefore, we have been leading peer support groups to manage people who get diagnosed with an NCD at community level, and then supported by a mid-level worker and by expert patients who can support each other in asking and answering questions which they are scared of asking physicians. So this mid-level health worker is something that I've been working in the last 10 years on. Why mid-level worker? Because doctors are not going to go into rural India, and we don't have a model for NCDs, even if we claim to have MCH, maternal and child health and infections at a level and clinic level. And this, as I said, the space has been taken by informal practitioners, and mid-level health provider can also contribute to MCH and infections care too, besides emergency care. ASHAs can only do as much. They cannot become Durga, that they can look after all these types of problems of all the complex problems also. And we actually have to break this hegemony of the physicians and public health by transferring power and also information to mid-level providers who can provide care in a much more decentralized way, rather than people coming up to district hospitals or medical colleges for their primary condition. We also worked on drug prices. It's something that I think physicians should also be worried about. 70% of cost of healthcare is accounted for by drugs, and purchasing drugs for care is a cause of impoverishment and indebtedness, has been clearly shown in many ways. 35% of deaths that happened in our program villages in one of the earliest years was in those who were less than 70 years of age, and they did not consult anyone illness that killed them, because they could not afford of the drugs. So the prices of drugs were getting decontrolled progressively since 85 till 2003, when the draft pharmaceuticals wanted to decontrol all the prices of drugs. And then we went to the Supreme Court with the case. So, as a physician, we were also not only, advocates for through providing healthcare, but also filing cases in the court. So we started not only running our own pharmacy on this, but also fighting out. If you know that albendazole is available in our hospital at 1 rupee per tablet, and in the market it is not anything cheaper than 12 to 15 rupees per tablet. Therefore, using the example of Tamil Nadu, which is able to provide drugs to everyone in Tamil Nadu at prices that they can easily negotiate, why not work, to understand the drug pricing? And we won this case in a sense in 2014. Even though there are the pricing policy is a little flawed, but all the essential drugs in the country at the moment are under price hold. So, and the fighting the big world of healthcare in India, which is focusing on primary care, which is focused only on CH. If you go to any district hospital in the country at the moment, and at about 7 p.m. in the evening, the only place that there is a bulb shining, light of the light is on in the entire district hospital is in the labor room. The entire hospital is otherwise shut, including the ward. And and in healthcare, the overwhelming focus is on the hospital, the doctor, and to the extent on the village health worker, which is who's often the lackey of the program, rather than being an empowered health provider. And the patient has hardly any agency in this care. We started this disease-based patient group over these 10 years, something that we feel has improved the compliance of illnesses as varied as alcohol dependence, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, specifically hypertension, mental illnesses, severe mental disorders, epilepsy, sickle cell disease, airborne contact dermatitis, rheumatoid arthritis, where they meet once a month. These patient peer support groups share their news, support compliance issues among each other, disease, and they learn. They start treatment from our hospital, but at another level, they are then meet together in a village only, where they can discuss and learn about a new thing, play and do some physical activity, do some microfinance, and take something. And we could show that the compliance rate improved for hypertension from something like 30% to 90%. In epilepsy, which is almost 95% that people are able to be compliant with drugs because of the peer support groups, not because of the advice that is given by doctors or by giving free drugs from even hospitals. So they can be, actually they can become health advocates. So in Chhattisgarh, we have shown that sickle cell disease patients have sat together and argued for giving them disability certificates and ensuring that they get drugs free and even get morphine when they have pain through their advocacy that they have been able to do, which us physicians could not have achieved on our own. And so patient group-centered care can achieve so much that professional-led healthcare never achieves, is what we have seen. And I might like to say here that surgery has been the stepchild of public health. So where there is no doctor, there is often no nurse, we know, but where there is a doctor, there is no surgeon. So we feel that we have highlighted the problem of even providing primary care surgery and ensuring that surgical skills are also provided to physicians, as well as the mid-level workers also should be provided with certain surgical skills. I would go to the last question about blood in rural areas. Is a question in point. 98% of blood banks in India are in cities where 31% people stay. The regulatory regime, because of the blood bank regime requirement to avoid commercial blood banking, the regulatory regime has decided that blood will not be available in rural areas. People have to come to the cities to take the blood. And blood storage units that have been advised by the government of India are actually poor in supply, and they're often not in most areas that I know of. So it has been done. The system did not want a single HIV transmission. True, but regulation cannot trump access. Why do we have to confront regulation against access? Can't we have a system where access could be also achieved with regulation that is more human? So we have been fighting on this, and we've been able to say, why don't we in army, in the defense forces at the moment, if you need blood, then a donor can be bled by a doctor there and tested in a particular way, and then the blood can be transfused. But in all the entire rural areas of this country, a doctor and a lab technician who are even who are doing surgeries or obstetrics ever cannot bleed a donor. You will go to jail if you do that. So we are fighting that case out, and otherwise till then we won't be able to ensure blood, and without blood you can manage sickle cell, severe malaria, epilepsies, emergency obstetrics is something that is possible without blood being in rural areas, and that is the reality of this country at the moment. So, and I say finally, life in medicine and in that sense in life otherwise is in making choices and taking care with the people. So we need to unearth the trivialization is what I would exhort all of you who are at the higher level of medicine to understand trivialization. Illnesses like RHD, rheumatic heart disease, has been trivialized. Tuberculosis has been trivialized by underestimating the finer points about it. Whether it is blood as a question, Birthing care, you give 4 walls and you call it institutional healthcare, institutional delivery. That is nonsense, I would say. And food and hunger and malnutrition have been also trivialized. So choices between a professional like all of us in an unequal and an unjust world could be, we could be against the people and say, no, I am for myself or for my life. Or you could be passive, okay, I know there are problems. This is not something that I can actually work on. Or you could be mentally active. You could support, efforts to improve healthcare for the poor. Or you could be physically active. You could be participating in that, in actually doing it. So paths have been taken in public health by various people. If you remember, there's a person called Norman Bethune, who was a surgeon in Canada who went to China and actually died in 1942 when he was fighting the Sino-Japanese war because of sepsis, and that time antibiotics had not come into that part of China. Che Guevara was also a physician who then got Cuba liberated and supported the rest of the Latin American countries also. I have a friend, Pramod Upadhyay, who makes healthcare technology based in a National Institute of Immunology in his free time. Rajnikant Arole was one doctor who gave rise to the concept of community health worker in 75 in Ahmednagar in Maharashtra. And I know Paul Biontich, who opened up the OpenMRS, the system for electronic medical records, which are now we have, it has developed further. Aravind Eye Institute has tried to sort of do like a assembly line care for contact or these intraocular lenses at less than 50 rupees per person. Lobbying at the UN level for NCDs has been done by one of those inveterate physicians called Paul Farmer in Partners in Health in Haiti and in the Western world and in Africa also. And Abhay and Rani Bang, we know, have been working in Central India trying to provide newborn care specifically. So you have to decide where as physicians and in academic institutions or elsewhere, whether small is beautiful. You would want to do something small but do it well, or big for impact. You want to take things to scale. If depending upon your choices, and that is a matter of unpersonal choice also. Asking the right questions is something that we should continue to do. I don't think only finding the right answers is a job. To ask the right questions is important. For example, what is the burden of diseases that poor in India suffers from? We have very poor data in this country that comes out from some medical college, so-called catchment areas, or some occasional NFHS studies, which and the National Family Health Survey basically looks at maternal and child health problems. They don't look at other burdens. What is the healthcare package that there should be level at every level of health facility? Should then ECG machine be there at a CHC level or at a PHC level? Is a question that we don't know. We haven't answered. At least there is no ECG machine in most PHCs in this country. Even if they may be only there at a district hospital level, which is at a level 20 lakh people. Imagine. There are so many technical questions in care of tuberculosis, malaria, and leprosy which need to be asked. Food and illnesses. So what is the role of food exactly? Has to be rightly asked. Why don't we have price all over essential drugs in all over? Should tertiary care be supported by the country? I think so. By the public system, yes. I don't think there's a huge requirement of tertiary care by the poorest in this country who cannot afford private care. And I think how should we handle NCDs? Should our conditional cash transfers a good solution for health? I don't think so. But this is a question that should be debated about. Is institutional delivery strategy the way it has been implemented in the last 20 years the right way to go? And what is the best way for human resources in health? We are trying to open more and more medical colleges. Is that the way forward, or should we support mid-level workers? We may have strong views on this, but this has to be discussed and settled also. Privatization for me, frankly, is a direct outsourcing, and I think it's something which is so damaging to public health. It has not worked anywhere in the world. Nowhere in the world, in the underserved world, that has worked. And in an unequal society, public financing and overwhelming majority of healthcare has to be provided by the public system. We we can't have criticism of the public health system because it is a necessary part to correct, but we can't throw the baby along with the bathwater. कि यार ये तो काम ही नहीं करते, इसको तो बंद करो, इसको सबको protect करो. UHC be the way for future. And I would end by this statement that I share from the Harry Potter. It is in our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. And I have made my choices. I am exhorting you to make your choices.